as a person that sees herself as an international human rights advocate, and this was very much part of my professional career of my life for almost 15 years, and I still feel committed and I do still believe in international human rights. I do have to come to terms with the recognition that the system is more broken than what I knew before. I have to admit this to myself, but just like you said, giving up on the system is not an option, because without the system, things would be much, much worse.
This is Women's Gallery, the podcast where we showcase women defining Jewish leadership today. My name's Joanne Greenaway, and each episode I interview one incredible female leader making a mark in her own way on the Jewish community. We explore different models of leadership in the context of schools, shuls, universities, Batei Din, and more. And today I'm really honoured to have with me one of my real role models, who is Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari, somebody I've known for many years and always hugely, hugely admired. And I'm really looking forward to discussing lots of really important, critical issues with today. Hello, Ruth. Very, very happy to have you.
Hi, Joe. I'm really honored to be here, and thank you so much for the warm welcome. Thank you.
Let me tell our listeners a little bit of your bio, your esteemed background, and all the many things that you're involved with. Ruth is a legal scholar in Israel, but internationally recognized as an advocate for women's rights, specializing in family law and the intersection of law, religion, and gender. She's a graduate of Yale Law School, and she serves as a professor of law at Bar-Ilan University. She's also the founding director of the Ruth and Emmanuel Rackman Center for the Advancement of the Status of Women, which is a leading institution which promotes gender justice in Israel. She served from 2006 to 2018, 3 consecutive terms as a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, called CEDAW. Twice she was the vice chair of CEDAW, and she speaks and lectures globally. She's served in many national leadership roles, including for 5 years when she was the chair of the advisory committee to the Authority for the Advancement of Women at Israel's Prime Minister's office. She has received many honours and grants, too many to list here, but just to list a few, she has the US Secretary of State's International Women of Courage Award. She has many international human rights prizes, and recently she's been awarded a number of honorary degrees, including from Brandeis University, from JTS, and from the Tel Aviv Jaffa Academic College, recognizing her huge impact on gender equality and international human rights law. So again, thank you so much for joining me. I want to start by going straight into October the 7th, because of the many important things and initiatives that you're involved with, you decided at that juncture to pivot and to focus in on researching and looking in depth at the sexual crimes of October the 7th. So it's not an easy place to start, but I wanted to take our listeners there because you co-founded something fundamentally important called the DINA Project that everybody should hear of if they haven't already. And you wanted to respond to the sexual violence that was committed during the October the 7th attacks. And I've heard you speak about this a couple of times, actually. And it left a huge impression on me because what you set up enabled you and others to spend thousands and thousands of hours analysing intelligence, survivor testimony, documentation. And from what I understand, you said that there was this lack of acknowledgement, even from the UN, from UN women who didn't acknowledge that it had happened even for 2 months. So I wanted to hear from you, or for you to share with us, what was it about that lack of acknowledgement and what happened that made you decide that this was something that you wanted to turn your attention towards gathering this evidence, and what made it so important to provide that kind of solid evidentiary framework to what happened on October the 7th?
I think October the 7th is a date that will always be in our minds. Everybody has a recollection of where she or he had been on that fateful day. And I wasn't even in Israel. I was during a lecture tour on the judicial overhaul that has taken place in Israel and still is taking place in Israel, and its impact on women. And I was actually on the way to continue for a fundraising tour for the Rackman Center. I was in Copenhagen, where one of my sons was studying, and they woke me up instead of going to shul on Simchat Torah to the unbelievable, incomprehensible news. And slowly, already on that day, I recollected all those horror stories that I heard from women in other places in the world, in very remote places in the world, such as Rwanda and Sudan, and Yazidi women from Syria and Nigeria. During the years that I was on the CEDAW committee, their horror stories of sexual violence that was part of the wars, part of the attacks that they had been subjected to. And it became clear to me that something happened on October 7 that we have never experienced before. And it was very, very much related to women and to the usage of women's bodies as a weapon of war. And at the same time that it was clear to me, and we already started hearing rumors and like scraps of information, I knew that I actually have a role to use my position on the international human rights front in this very complex arena, to use my connections, to use my knowledge of the system, and to get the world to react, to condemn Hamas, to recognize, to acknowledge that crimes against humanity took place in the worst form of using sexual violence as a tool of war. I started emailing, I started connecting my previous colleagues, friends, other organizations in the international human rights system that I was familiar with, such as UN Women or the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And I also started connecting with other women like me from civil society in Israel, who also felt, each of us felt, that we have a role, that we have to do something, that we have to shake the world, and we have to seek the recognition and justice for what had happened. And I should say that now the DINA Project had evolved into a project within the Rackman Center. And of course, I'm not doing this work alone, but very, very closely with colleagues, former Judge Nava Ben-Or, who had also formerly been the Deputy Solicitor General of Israel, and Colonel in Reserve Sharon Zagagi-Pinchas, who had formerly been the Chief Military Prosecutor. And together with Nava and Sharon, we co-authored the book.
You talked about this denial in the world, and I wondered whether on the back of this work that you've done and the work that you've done so far, if you feel that the world has reacted. You produced 17 witnesses to rape, to gang rape, to these horrific sexual crimes. But that's such a small number out of the hundreds that we know who were victims, who have tragically been killed on that day or who were taken hostages. And there's so much trauma that hasn't been spoken of. So do you feel that the evidence you produced has been enough to deal with that kind of skepticism and denial? How's it been received?
So the thing is that we will never know for certain how many women and men also were actually assaulted and were victimized in that way of being sexually violated as part of the Hamas terror attack, because, as you rightly said, they had been murdered immediately after or during the assault itself. So what we had to find out is through the eyewitnesses and the ear witnesses who did survive and had witnessed these attacks in real time, whether they had hid in the bushes or from other locations in the area. We do know that very few victims of sexual violence did survive, but they are still too traumatized to speak. We know from everyday sexual violence, for lack of a better term, that it can take years for survivors to speak up. Sometimes they never do. And all the more so when the assault is part of a terror attack, when the life itself is in danger, where one sees their close friends and loved ones being murdered in front of their eyes. So the possibility for them to speak is really not an option. And that is the challenge of proving, of collecting all the pieces of evidence and testimonies that are available and putting them together and weighing them from a legal perspective, employing our professional experience and expertise in these areas of law, and showing that there is enough evidence. And of course, we do rely on investigative work that was done by others. And this is where we should point out to the role that UN entity did have in this endeavor, and that is the role of the Under Secretary General of the United Nations, his special representative on sexual violence in conflict, Pramila Patten, who visited Israel in January and February of 2024 to do a fact-finding mission. And that was, you asked about the reaction of the international organizations and of the UN. So we have to understand that the UN is not one monolithic entity. There are so many different agencies and individuals that hold so many positions, and there is a huge difference between their reaction. Pramila Patten was actually a former colleague of mine on the CEDAW committee, and I reached out to her on October 8th just to seek advice on how to deal with this matter, which we never experienced before. And that was when I understood that if our mission is to gain the recognition from the highest authority of the world, which is the UN, which is the Secretary General of the UN, we have to ensure that all the information that's available, all the information that can be gathered, will enter the annual report of the Secretary General. And for that to happen, his representative has to come to Israel and conduct this kind of mission, of fact-finding mission. Israel has to invite her to come into Israel.
It's so important. The fact that you have these contacts and you understand these mechanisms has been hugely valuable to Israel.
I think so. And I'm very, very grateful that the decision makers also accepted this venue and understood the importance and overcame their reluctance to collaborate with the UN, overcame the skepticism or the distrust, which perhaps is justifiable vis-a-vis certain organs of the UN. But again, we have to employ this very nuanced understanding that we should not generalize, and we should find our allies. We should find those professionals who have integrity and who do their work unbiased, looking also at what perhaps Israel is doing, but being able to recognize, to see the truth where it is, and to say for the first time in Pramila Patten's report in March of 24 that sexual violence did take place in the form of rapes and gang rapes in at least 3 different locations in Israel, and that the hostages, that at that time there were still dozens of female hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, that they were subjected to ongoing sexual violence, including rape. That was really the game changer. And then came more, and that was the work that we could rely on in the work of the DINA Project, and build on that, and also gain information from all the returned hostages, all those who returned and were so brave and courageous to share their stories, to share their nightmare.
So that's huge in terms of an acknowledgement actually about Hamas having committed those crimes on the back of that report and that visit. It sounds to me like that was a huge breakthrough. I wonder then, you've spoken also about accountability of the terrorists for their crimes. So what happens next in that regard? Is that something we can seriously expect?
So that was not the end. Probably the most important step took place just a couple of months ago in August, when the Secretary General published the next annual report for 2024, where he actually added Hamas to the list of those entities who use sexual violence as a tactic tool, as a weapon of war, side by side with ISIS, with Boko Haram, with the rapid forces in Sudan, with all those terrorist organizations who are completely outcast from the world, who are being sanctioned, who the whole world unites against to
Right, but it's so obvious to us that Hamas should be on that list, but actually to get to that point involves so much work behind the scenes,
right,
and so much complex, nuanced maneuvering that, amazing to have got there. So can the terrorists be brought to trial? Is that something that can happen through international mechanisms, through the ICC, even though Israel's not a signatory? How is that even possible?
So actually, the first addressee to this are our own Israeli prosecution and our own mechanisms for justice and accountability. And we are still waiting for the decision of the Ministry of Justice and the military. And it is obviously also a political question on how exactly those Nukhba Hamas terrorists who are being held by Israel, there are as far as we know, approximately 200 who are actually waiting trial. So we are waiting to see how the process of prosecuting them will take place. And our goal of the DINA Project is to make sure that when they are being charged, the whole issue of sexual violence, of rapes, of sexual assaults, of mutilations will also be included in the prosecution. With respect to international mechanisms, it is more complex. There are those countries that actually employ universal jurisdiction, and there already are processes that are ongoing in several countries in the world. And what we hope is that the information that we gathered and the way that we built what we call the evidentiary infrastructure, it can be utilized for those processes, for those legal processes that are already and will take place. The ICC is obviously not a venue for a formal process brought by Israel. But again, the information
The
can be
ICC
utilized.
being the International Criminal Court, I should have said.
Yes, the International Criminal Court. And as you rightly pointed out, Israel is not party to the International Criminal Court. We should point out that the information from Patton's report was included when an international arrest warrant was issued by the ICC in, I think it was in May of 2024, arrest warrant against Muhammad Def and Yihya Sinwar, which obviously is no longer relevant because they had been thankfully killed. But it just goes to show that the recognition of these acts had already been included in these processes of seeking recognition and seeking justice and accountability.
Really critical work. Thank you. I want to start thinking more about women's justice issues within Israel. Before that, to finish what we were talking about in relation to the UN, because I think what you said is that one cannot tar the UN with one brush. I raise this because so many people are skeptical about the UN. There's been so much talk for years about how those who are responsible for human rights within the UN are sometimes the worst abusers, and how can we trust it? And particularly in relation to Israel, a lot of feeling of being attacked unfairly, disproportionately by the UN. So am I right in understanding from you that really you think our response to the UN should be not so broad brush, and that we should continue working with the UN and should continue to place it on a pedestal, but really understand from the inside who we can work with and how it operates and get the best from it, in a sense?
This is a very, very tough question. To be honest, I am still debating it within myself, because the blow that I personally felt when, for instance, my colleagues on the CEDAW committee, when they concluded their session, which happened to take place in October of 2023, starting on October 9th. And again, I emailed them and I talked to them, and I expected them to come up with a very strong statement of condemnation of Hamas. And the one that they issued at the end of the session after 3 weeks, at the very last hour of the session, just like before Shabbat, I remember getting it and just bursting into tears, because there was no mention of Israel and no mention of Hamas and no mention of sexual violence against Israeli women, just very, very broad terms of women should be part of peace processes, etc., like really saying nothing. So, and then there was the silence. But UN Women, so as a person that sees herself as an international human rights advocate, and this was very much part of my professional career of my life for almost 15 years, and I still feel committed, and I do still believe in international human rights, I do have to come to terms with the recognition that the system is more broken than what I knew before. I have to admit this to myself, but just like you said, giving up on the system is not an option, because without the system, things would be much, much worse. For Israel too, how can we just adopt a position of saying, get rid of the UN or step out of the UN? Israel exists thanks to the UN and thanks to international law. So we have to find the right way to maneuver. And like you said, this broad brush is not the way to go. And as we prove in our work of the DINA Project, we can find our allies. There are other individuals and decision makers and people in very important positions within the system who do recognize that the situation is not black and white, that Israel, maybe it is to be blamed and to be accountable for its own wrongdoing, but at the same time, on October 7, Israel was the victim and Hamas was the villain, and the crimes against humanity were done by Hamas and not by Israel. And the whole situation is much, much more nuanced. There are those who understand that and do carry their work accordingly.
Yeah, the world order feels very fragile right now. So I think these institutions that we do have, we still need to work with and get the best from.
The Big Questions of Jewish Belief podcast is back for a second season. I'm Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum, and in this new season, I talk to 4 brilliant minds and proud Jews about their personal beliefs. Anthony Julius speaks to the dead. Naomi Alderman loves a good argument. Adam Wagner sees religion in human rights. And Professor Stephen Frosch says God is not about what exists, but about what is real. Come grapple with the unknowable. Follow Big Questions of Jewish Belief, Season 2 by LSJS on all major podcast platforms.
Let me ask you about the Rackman Centre. And I do this in relation to Agunot and to the work that you were mentioning earlier in relation to divorce, because as you mentioned, it's an issue that's very close to my heart, but it's something that you've been involved in on the inside for decades, and particularly through the Rackman Centre, which, as I understand it, is set up with this mechanism whereby you both represent women who come to you, who you represent in the courts and the rabbinical courts, I think. But at the same time, you're also involved in lobbying government for legal changes that have had a huge impact on things like raising the marriage age, other kinds of laws that relate to women. I wondered if you could explain to us, how is it that you try to make change? You know, what is your theory of change? How does it work, particularly through the Rackman Centre? And then, you know, we can talk a little bit more about it in relation to divorce specifically, because I'm constantly looking at how is it that we can make change in that area.
So we indeed managed to come up with a very, very unique model, utilizing the fact that we operate from academia, from a law faculty at Bar-Ilan University. So we combine, it's a hybrid model. It's top-down and bottom-up. And it's a model that where we do in everything that we engage with, we come from like both directions. So we combine the academic expertise and the research together with activism. We actually translate the expertise into activism. We operate a legal aid clinic for women in divorce proceedings, where we also combine educational work for students in their second year of law studies at the Faculty of Law at Bar-Ilan. And they actually help the lawyers who, in a way, we operate a law office within the center. We have 5 full-time lawyers who specialize in divorce and in family matters, who represent pro bono, without charge, women in all judicial proceedings having to do with divorce and with family matters, whether it is the rabbinical courts, also the Sharia courts. Sometimes we collaborate with Muslim lawyers, and family courts, and going all the way to the Grand Rabbinical Court or to the Supreme Court or to the High Court of Justice. And from the work that we do there, we gain knowledge about what issues need to be tackled, where the law should be changed, and how it should be changed and reformed. So next to this legal aid program, where we also do consultations, about 500 women annually receive free legal advice in their matters. And from the information that we gain there, we take it to the section, to the Department of Advocacy and Legislation, where we come up with bills, with ideas, regulations, laws that need to be amended. And we are practically in the Knesset every day. When the Knesset is in session, we're there every day on all the committees, the Women's Rights Committee, the Committee on Legislation and Constitution. What we do find in recent years is that we actually have to be there in order to push back against the regression, against all the bills that are being debated to encroach on women's rights. And you mentioned the bills where we were successful, such as increasing the marital age, making it 18 for both women and men, or ensuring the minimal presence of women in the committee to appoint the rabbinical judges, and other amendments that we managed to do throughout the year. Now it's mostly the work of pushing back. But going back to our model, what we also do is by having our own experts also in Jewish law, and by relying on also on academic expertise, we can bring novel arguments and novel positions to proceedings within the rabbinical courts, and by that also change from within. Other work that we're doing with this ideology of changing from within is to advance the possibility of women's presence within the institution of the rabbinical court. So we very successfully led the struggle to have women serve as legal advisors to dayanim, to rabbinical judges. We're currently back to a struggle of having a woman head the rabbinical court as a director general, and there are more struggles in that direction. What we also do in the Rackman Center is like any other academic center. We publish research.
It's really important. I'm using it a lot at the moment. It's the best research that comes out on the rabbinical courts.
Good. Also data about the rabbinical courts, other position papers, such as, for instance, explaining the differences between what's called de facto union, people who live together without being married, the difference, their rights, their obligations when compared to a formally married couple. And this is, like a service to the public for those young couples who want to assess their situation to decide whether they want to get married or perhaps live together without marriage. The situation in Israel is very peculiar in that respect. It offers what you used to call common law marriage, which are almost identical to every purpose with a formal marriage. And it's a whole different subject to talk about. I just want to mention also that in recent years, what we also provide at the center is the emotional support, where we make use of being in university, the Department of Psychology, School of Social Work. So graduate students who need to do training for being qualified as therapists, they provide this service to our clients, to those women who call and seek the legal support, so we can also offer them and provide them with emotional support. So they get like a holistic envelope, and it's a very, very unique institution, also worldwide, not just in Israel.
I think each and everything that you've mentioned is so critically important. I, for one, am very, very grateful that work is happening. I wondered whether you had a thought, because you talk about making change from the inside and being able to impact on rabbinical courts. And as you know, I've spent a lot of time talking to women who are activists in this area, and so many have almost decided that really the only solution is to work with the civil courts and to advocate for civil marriage in Israel. But I wonder whether you think that there can be change within the rabbinical courts such that we can continue to rely on religious marriage and divorce as the model that we can work with.
I believe that pluralism and choice in marriage is a very basic human right. I'm not advocating for getting rid of religious marriage and divorce, but I am advocating for making it one among many and providing solutions, perhaps relying also on civil intervention to those problems that the religious courts are still reluctant in providing solutions for, primarily the aguna problem, the mesoravot get problem. And we all know that there are solutions within halacha. There are ways to overcome it. The late Rabbi Rackman, on whose name the center that I'm heading is being named, he was the one who actually advocated and exercised. He personally created the Beit Din, which is now the International Beit Din, to employ a very special technique or tool, halachic tool, to solve the most difficult cases of reluctant husbands in abusive marriages. I do believe that when there is civil marriages introduced in Israel, this will also force the rabbinical courts to adopt a more hesitate from saying a lenient way, because by saying lenient, people might think that this is, it's not halachic, it's not kosher, but that's not true. The halacha is so varied. The halacha, in almost every case, offers such a wide variety of tools, of choices, and there are precedents for so many tools that are not being employed today for wrong reasons, for reasons of wanting control, of wanting power, for political reasons, not for the authentic, pure reasons that halachic people should actually employ.
Yeah, I think what you said makes a huge amount of sense, that you're advocating for really offering more choice and not imposing one system on everybody. But by offering more choice, that will encourage each part of the system itself to improve and to work the way that it can and to work better for everybody. So let me finish by asking you to reflect. We've talked about so many different things, interconnected issues related to women's rights, but so many fascinating and crucially important issues for women and in turn for Israeli society. So many people I talk to who work on these areas feel this sense of resignation. And you yourself mentioned this regression that's happened under the current government. I really talk to a lot of people who have given up with this kind of work, are refusing to work within the system and only want to rely on solutions outside of the system. But I hear from you that you're continuing, you keep on going, you're continuing to work within the rabbinical courts as well. So tell us the secret to how is it that you keep going? How do you remain optimistic and really continue to bring other people along with you to do this important work?
Actually, I wouldn't describe myself as optimistic. I'm not
Are you
an
exhausted?
optimistic person by nature.
But you're smiling. I can see you on the screen and you're smiling.
But I am hopeful, and I know that we have no choice but to keep hoping and to trust that we do have the strength and we do have the stamina and we do have the ability, the capacity to continue fighting and to succeed. There's just no other choice. And it goes along in I think in every arena that I'm active in, whether it is the fate of the state of Israel. We don't have any other state. We have no choice but to keep fighting for sustaining its democracy and for bringing it back to the right direction. I'm not willing to give up on the international law and on international human rights and human rights mechanisms, because we don't have others, and we must change them so that they fulfill their mission. And likewise, the halacha and the halachic system and the Jewish law, it is part of my identity. I'm not prepared for anybody to take it away from me. I will continue fighting to make it right. And it's just simply the realization that we don't have the luxury to give up on anything.
I'm with you. Thank you for your hope. I feel quite emotional because really I think that hope is what lifts all of us, and what happens in Israel, what you're doing, impacts on the whole Jewish people. It helps us to continue to be Zionist and continue to fight for the Israel that we want to all be part of. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe, for everything that you do, for spreading the message, for being this important platform, and for having me on your show. Thank you.
Thank all of you for listening and being part of this conversation. One request really does help so much when listeners review Women's Gallery, because then tells the podcast platforms to show it to more listeners like you. So please do just take a minute and give Women's Gallery a review. Thank you so much. And I look forward to being with you next time on Women's Gallery.